Welcome, Gothamites. This is the Arkham Sessions, the only podcast that analyzes every episode of Batman the Animated Series through the eyes of a clinical psychologist. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City and beyond, Dr. Andrea Letamendi. Hello, Andrea.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing really well. For the last week or so, you and I have been playing with this new social media platform that we talked about a little bit on the last show called IMZY. That's IMZY.com. It's basically, if you picture Facebook with a feed, but then combine it with a community forum where other people can post on that feed and they can all interact with one another. It's kind of awesome.
But with a super easy level, super user-friendly approach.
Yeah.
Like all the mechanisms involved are just very straightforward, and the interaction is incredibly straightforward. So you can just jump right in there, join conversations, upload information, video, sound, podcast, audio, whatever you want. And it's been pretty cool. We have over 100 community members, and we've been interacting with folks. And I do have to say that for me, it has been a great way to hear feedback.
Yeah.
Well, I guess read feedback from folks and get to know our listeners better. I mean, sure, we have emails coming in and we have Twitter and we have other ways that we can interact with folks, but this is a nice platform that really allows enough space for that. I mean that figuratively as well as literally, that folks can really go in there and kind of give their perspective and talk about the things that we talk about on the show in a way that they know that other Arkham Sessions listeners and fans will be looking at and reading and interacting with. So it's a really cool community, and it's a really cool method of getting us all to be on the same page.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Yes, we have Twitter, and we've got a lot of really great members on Twitter. We've got a lot of folks who have joined our Facebook page, and we, of course, have our email, but at the same time, I sort of feel like we lead that. You know, it's like we will ask someone on Twitter, you know, what's your favorite Batman the Animated Series episode? And the responses are all great, but they're all separate. They're not necessarily part of a bigger conversation. On Facebook, it's a little more of a bigger conversation, but that one isn't necessarily like IMZY, where, for instance, one of our loyal listeners, Rev Sully, he has started a couple of different posts on the IMZY Arkham Sessions community, where just today he asked how to pronounce Ra's al Ghul. And we're going to need that in a little bit because we are, in fact, talking about Ra's al Ghul in this episode. Or is it Ross or Raz or Raj?
See,
that was a test. That was a test for you, and you failed, Drea.
Dang.
It's Ra's al Ghul. But it gives a lot of different people the opportunity to come in and talk about those things, and it's awesome. One of the things that we got from this was a great question from a community member over at IMZY. Her name is Jalay. And she asks, I'm interested to hear analysis on how high intelligence and technical understanding, in other words, or for example, Harley being an MD or a PhD, Poison Ivy holding a PhD in botany, etc., might exacerbate their obsessions relating to those subjects and the overall psychology of how humans are prone to irrational and dangerous decision-making when mental health issues are a factor, despite having high IQ / appearing in control of their mind. So the first part of that, I think we've kind of discussed before when we've talked about high IQ versus low EQ. Like we talked about a lot of people for whatever reason, the higher the IQ, the lower the EQ, the emotional quotient. So the more logical you are, the less you understand human beings and, whatever sometimes.
Not for everybody, but in
Right.
in many cases. So
Yeah.
we don't want to generalize, but especially for extremely high IQ, you have folks that fall into that category. There is a tendency to have lower EQ. There's
Right.
not necessarily a low capacity for EQ. It's just it's almost like the energy goes towards the IQ versus the EQ.
It's almost like two different sides of the brain. One of them is dominant, maybe. Like one of them is like, I'm processing this, but I don't understand this other, or no?
No, I mean, the whole right side, left side of the brain idea
Let's go front and back.
has been debunked. And the whole point about the brain integration is that all parts of the brain are pretty active. Even during sleep, our brain is pretty active. But for the most part, the majority of our brain is activated, and it's not like one side is working and the other side isn't, or one side is dominant and the other side. Unless you have some kind of brain injury, for most of us, both sides are fairly active. So that has kind of been a myth regarding the right side, left side of the brain.
So what you're telling me is if I was on Facebook last week and I took a test that told me that I was mostly right-brained, it lied to me. You're telling me that tests on Facebook aren't necessarily accurate.
I would question. And, the other thing, too, is that being highly intelligent or having a high IQ doesn't make you exempt from having mental health problems or mental health disorders. Mm-hmm. So I think it sounds like the question has to do with whether the high IQ can exacerbate symptoms or even feed into a mental health problem.
Yeah, like maybe, it specifically, any analysis on the high intelligence and technical understanding and how that might exacerbate their obsessions.
Well, it depends on what their obsessions are, and it depends on what their mental health symptoms are. I could see cases, and I have seen cases, in particular, anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder, where the core symptoms involve ruminations, worry. We're talking about excessive worry, minute to minute daily worry and ruminations. And a lot of times folks who experience those worries will turn to what they would call fact-finding or evidence, or they'll look to even textbook material, scientific material to back up those worries.
Oh, wow.
So, and we can even think about cases involving paranoia and psychotic types of symptoms, such as concerns around persecution or ideas, thoughts that, I'll give you an example, that, TV shows are giving you a very specific, direct, personalized message. So you might go and do some research or find further evidence that that's the case. Now, if you happen to be someone who has access to that resource material, so you're not just highly intelligent, but you have access, you have the means, you have the resources, you might be more able to obtain that information to then sort of fulfill that excessive need. And it can be pretty, it can be a cycle, and then you could sort of get stuck there. So,
Sure.
And I can see cases, and I have seen cases where folks fall into, intelligence levels that are not quite what Gillet is talking about. So intelligence isn't necessarily a strong correlation of the severity of a mental health disorder. But certainly someone with more resources, someone with higher IQ, someone with access to that information, those things usually correlate with high IQ. Mm-hmm. People with graduate degrees, people with medical degrees, that type of access can certainly give someone more, make those things more available to them.
So see, that's the kind of interaction that you get when you come over and join the IMSI community. As I look at it, we have 100 additional invitations that we can send out. And there's a free t-shirt that you could get, which has been all the rage. Everyone loves this t-shirt.
It's pretty amazing.
Go to mz.com/Arkham.
Talk.
This episode, we're doing Showdown, which is a very special episode because Batman basically isn't in the entire episode. But there is a Batman sort of proxy or substitute, and that is a gentleman by the name of Jonah Hex. How much did you know about Jonah Hex going into this episode?
Not very much.
And by that, you mean you're not familiar with like just Jonah Hex, the character, or like Western characters of DC's?
All of the above.
Jonah Hex's first appearance was an advertisement for All-Star Western number 10. And that dated back to 1971. He's had his own stories. He's had his own books. But for the most part, he is a bounty hunter who is of the Southern variety and was a Confederate soldier, but had a really hard time with the slavery element. So he was always conflicted about, does he go up against his home in the South or does he stand by his home in the South? So, which, by the way, you would think is DC's way of sort of like making him a good guy, but this legitimately was a thing in the Civil War. There were people who legitimately just wouldn't raise an arm against their home state. So if the state went one way, they went that way. If the state went another way, they went that way. So for some people, like Jonah Hex, this was a big deal. And that's what DC Comics did. As they developed his character, he was more and more conflicted with his Confederate roots. And clearly Jonah was injured in some way. He's got a very two-facey sort of look to him.
Yeah, his face is messed up. So, okay, just to be clear, he was not a Batman character. He was not brought into Gotham through time travel or anything. Like, he had his own comic book.
Correct. So let's talk about this episode, Showdown. The Showdown really doesn't involve Batman and Robin at all. I mean, it kind of does because they break up this sort of theft that's going on by a bunch of guys who look like the symbiote Spider-Man. And they realize very early on that Ra's al Ghul is behind this. And then they try to track him down and they realize that it's a very easy thing to do.
It's too easy. He wants us to find him.
So Ra's al Ghul wants Batman and Robin to find him. You and I have talked a little bit about Ra's al Ghul in the past, Drea, and we've talked about narcissism. We've talked about this overwhelming sense of, we even described maybe like this sort of godlike sense.
Right.
He wants Batman and Robin to find him. What's that all about?
Well, he clearly doesn't feel threatened by either. Well, certainly not by Robin, but he doesn't feel threatened by Batman.
Yeah, and they retrieve a tape, which they then put into the Batmobile.
I anticipated meeting you tonight, Detective.
Ooh.
Yeah, it almost sounds like, well, this whole heist was just a plan in order to get Batman this audio tape. So what's on the audio tape? The audio tape is Ra's al Ghul just telling them a story. And it's a story about the 1880s as the United States was moving west. This is post-Civil War. It's the Western expansion. We see railroads, and we see Ra's al Ghul and this other gentleman, Arkady Duvall. And the two of them are behind this master plan of Ra's. Let's take a listen.
I'll destroy the railroad and bomb other railroad junctions as I move eastward toward Washington. Once Washington is in flames, I'll force the United States government to declare me master of America.
So that sounds very much like that narcissistic attitude that we're used to. And again, he's doing the whole, like, I want to protect the earth. The Western expansion is destroying the land. So I'm going to destroy the things that are destroying the land. And then I'm going to force America to make me its master.
without any kind of regard or understanding of the idea that the railroad project could bring humanity together. Like that could be something that is positive and lead to community building and great things for these, these small societies.
Yeah, you make an excellent point.
I do.
Yeah, that's fantastic. The person that's with him, Arkady Duvall, is wanted, and he's been wanted across 12 states from back east. And we know this because this bounty hunter, Jonah Hex, has shown up into town, and he's asking about him. Now, this guy doesn't quite sound like he's on the same level of Ra's al Ghul when it comes to maybe, I don't know, social norms.
I know that two-bit skunk. He hurt one of my girls real bad.
Let's talk about the fact that in Batman the Animated Series, we've got a woman who's basically running a brothel.
Yeah, that was...
If you know saloon environments in the 1880s, you know that you've got some gaming, beer, and...
Prostitutes.
And he hurt one of her girls real bad. Which is apparently something that he's used to doing because that's actually what he is wanted for 12 states away.
Yeah, it's interesting that he is, the crime he's known for is violating women. And it's not clear, I mean, obviously because it's a cartoon, I'm just not sure, did he murder some of these women? Like, is it possible that these are... horrific things that he's doing.
Maybe really it's like Unforgiven, which was around this time, maybe the Clint Eastwood, Morgan Freeman movie. Maybe it's along those lines where you got a guy who like cut a girl up, and now she's got all scarred and she can't make us money. So we're gonna go after this guy. Maybe it's that kind of thing. So they get Jonah Hex.
What would compel him? Like you have to think about the time.
They're just bad people.
Yeah.
You've seen these movies. They are bad people. Now, granted, I wasn't there, so I don't know for a fact. But I like to think they were bad people. Let's talk about people who might look bad, but aren't necessarily bad. And that's Jonah Hex. He's just not a nice guy to look at. He's got a voice very similar to Killer Croc. The guy... isn't someone you would necessarily think of as the hero character. He's no Bruce Wayne.
No.
But deep down, he is kind of Bruce Wayne. He is going after people who have wronged other people. And, he's fighting for the underdogs. And he sort of becomes the Bruce Wayne Batman substitute in this particular episode. One thing I noticed is as the sheriff comes in, he instantly recognizes him and says, I'm surprised you haven't killed anyone yet.
Just remember them wanted posters say dead or alive. You might try alive this time. First time for everything.
So unlike Batman, Jonah Hex is used to killing everyone that he comes in contact with. And he's got a reputation for it.
Well, times are different then.
I don't know. The fact that he's got this reputation, it might make him a better vigilante. It might make him a better hero. Like, it might be like, hey, look, we know you're going to kill people. Would you want to be caught by Jonah Hex if you knew that guy doesn't take anyone in alive? I wouldn't. It would probably keep me from hurting one of her girls real bad.
Well, he sort of blurs the lines because he's going after... It sounds like he's going after men who are doing really heinous things, right? These aren't robbers. I mean, the guys he's going after are themselves are wanted. Mm-hmm. So, on the other hand, though, he's apt to go toward violence and murder himself. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of an interesting dilemma.
And he seems
he's not
okay
necessarily
with
a hero.
Right, and he's okay with it. It's not even necessarily I'm going up against the bad guy. Like, he sort of threatens the sheriff, too, at one point, where he's like, well, I might be up in years or mileage, but I could still shoot the wings off a fly, especially if it were a plump fly. And he's suggesting I could still shoot you, Sheriff, if I've got the right, motivation. So, it doesn't even matter if you're on the good or bad side. Jonah could probably take you out one way or the other. I like that this episode is using Jonah Hex as Batman, as sort of an alternate reality Batman. Did you think?
No, I didn't really see it that way, but now that you describe it, I can understand why Batman isn't really in this episode, but you have this figure who's essentially doing the same thing that Batman does.
It's almost like a backdoor pilot, like, hey, kids, would you watch a Jonah Hex cartoon series? Because we'll introduce it through this Batman series. Like, it was kind of cool. Now, one thing that we get to see the difference specifically between Arkady Duvall and Ra's al Ghul. They go into a cave, and there we see that they're basically building what looks like an airship. Now, I personally wouldn't build this airship in this way, but I'm not Ra's al Ghul.
Well, how would you build an airship?
I probably wouldn't make it of steel. If I want it to fly, I probably wouldn't make it out of metal. But I'm not Ra's. I don't know the things that Ra's knows. He's been around a long time. But we do see that he's got henchmen that are basically wearing giant suits of armor. And Arkady Duvall decides whipping them would be a good idea to speed up production. Now, this really upsets Ra's.
I've told you repeatedly, this is not how I do things.
So Ra's has a little bit of a heart. He doesn't believe in whipping his workers. Either that or he realizes that a leather whip won't do much on a suit of armor. I don't know which, but, Either way, he's trying to say that Arkady has a completely different view of how the world should work. Arkady, by the way, played brilliantly by Malcolm McDowell in this episode, doesn't necessarily understand why this is a bad thing. He thinks he's doing all right. Drea, what was your take on Arkady Duvall?
Well, already knowing that he's violated women and that he's engaged in violence and that he's, essentially a brutal person, I wasn't surprised that he's abusing these workers. I mean, already you can tell the workers are essentially enslaved by Duvall and Ra's. But there's this sense of extreme brutality and just this lack of empathy. And it's interesting about the dynamic because Ra's does not see himself as a brutal man. And so that distinction is made very clear. And there's this sense of the expression of honor on Ra's side, right? Ra's side.
Yeah.
The side of Ra's. Ra's side.
He definitely sees himself as a man of honor, as a man of civility. Meanwhile, this other guy, this younger guy, who's also sort of Britishy, sort of accenty, which might be a hint for later, but we're not giving that away yet. That guy is brutal. They do a really good job of showing the difference in how Ra's doesn't necessarily even like interacting with this younger guy, Duvall. He does a nice job of separating himself, which I think the episode, I think the animated series in general does a really good job of showing Ra's al Ghul as this guy who has principles and is willing to do certain things, but isn't necessarily an evil person. What do you think?
Well, I think that this is one of few shows that will introduce the complexity of good versus bad, because you have three characters, Jonah Hex, Arkady Duvall, Ra's al Ghul, who are essentially representing different versions of bad, right? One of them has a lot of honor, integrity, and strongly believes in some higher power, whereas but doing some things that one could consider criminal or one could consider a violation of other people's human rights and dignities. then you have Jonah Hex, who is actively seeking out criminals, but is willing to enact violence and even murder. And then you have, of course, Arkady Duvall, who is visibly being brutal and has a history of violating people and potentially murdering people and targeting women. So at any time, that's heinous, but around this time in particular, where women are seen very differently, it's particularly heinous. And so we, potentially as children watching this, right, we have this complicated introduction of like, who is the bad person? What makes a person bad? And who can we not forgive, but who can we understand a little bit more in terms of their motivations, in terms of their, their multiple dimensions. And I don't know, I think that multi-layered perspective of the villain, especially with us trying to figure out who exactly is the villain here, because that's what we do with these shows, especially as kids. That is something that you don't often get to exercise when you're watching cartoons.
Well, and they do a really good job as cartoon writers of establishing Jonah Hex as the hero, in that the woman that comes up to him in the beginning instantly sort of takes a shining to him, where like she's a little grossed out by his appearance, but then as soon as he says, "I'm looking for this guy," and she's like, "Oh, I hate that guy. I'm going to help you out." It's one of those, and he's got a very charming sense about him. Even his dialogue where she's like, are you a bounty hunter? And he's like, "Oh, just to pay for my piano lessons." That's not true, but it makes him endearing. He becomes a very charming character. And then later on, when she takes him out beyond the dunes somewhere, to see this cave where these mysterious lights are coming from, he comes right out and says, "You should get along now, little missy, because I think things are about to get loud and busy soon." He's basically like, "I want you to get out of harm's way, because stuff's going to go down, and I'm probably going to make sure of it." He is very protective as well. But then later on, as would generally happen in a Batman the Animated Series episode, there is a big brawl at the end. This airship goes up. Now, this is an ironclad ship. In fact, it looks very similar. It's sort of a cross between the CSS Virginia and the USS Monitor. If you're in any way a fan of the Civil War,
or steampunk.
I am a nut for the Civil War.
Or steampunk.
Sure, yes. You can go the steampunk route.
It's a metal airship. Come on.
Well, and what's weird is like the sort of the balloony areas made of wood. I don't even understand how that part works. I don't understand any part of this ship. This is not something that I would have tried to design, but it has made a reputation for itself as a monster of the skies. It's got cannons, it's got Gatling guns, and it is just mowing down, people there in the town. Well, I mean, not the people, but because it's
the folks working on the railroad. Yeah. And there's just an all-out battle between those two sides. And I mean, it gets a little weird. Suddenly you have the seamen, airmen, I guess you would call them. None of them have shirts. They're just...
Yeah, and let me tell you something. I've never seen a redhead that buff.
They're all redheads, too. They're like
except for maybe Carrot Top. And you don't want to see Carrot Top dressed the way these guys are dressed.
No. Suddenly you see like 6... shirtless, redheaded pirates in the sky, just going at it.
Well, and they're firing off cannons, and they're like I said, they're shooting hand cranked Gatling guns, and Jonah Hex jumps on board and instantly starts fighting. And this is another great thing that the writers of this episode have done. He doesn't go after Ra's al Ghul. He goes after Arkady Duvall. That's the villain. That is the villain of this episode. No matter whose grand plan this was, we have established very early on that this is the guy we're supposed to dislike. And so he goes up to Arkady, and he's ready to fight him basically with a knife. Arkady is apparently fancies himself a bit of a swordsman and challenges him.
Let's you and me dance.
So we talked about the separation between Raish and Arkady a little bit. Raish abandons ship and tells the rest of his crew, everyone abandon ship. This thing is going down. Jonah Hex has destroyed the ironclad beast in the sky.
But what about Duvall?
Leave that fool to his fate.
He's ready to write off Arkady Duvall. What are your thoughts about that moment?
I think he's already labeled Duvall. Like, he's already decided that he's not worthy. I mean, this will make a lot more sense later on, but he's not worthy to take on this mission, right? Past this point.
Right.
So he deserves what's coming to him.
Right. Jonah Hex basically turns a new leaf. He's got the opportunity to kill Duvall, and he doesn't. He says that he's going to allow him to live, but only because it's too much trouble to drag your carcass back to the East Coast. You know, he's got 12 states.
Why do we even use audio? You should just do all the voices.
You know, when it comes to that kind of character, I can do it. So, you know, Jonah Hex has turned over a new leaf. This is a character that he's not going to kill. So that's got to mean something, right? Like, there's got to be progress in the Jonah Hex character. Could he be becoming the 1880s Batman?
Maybe Jonah Hex prefers that people view him as someone who's willing to murder, but doesn't actually do it. Like, he's trying to create this image, just like Batman does, this image that he's dangerous and threatening and willing to break and violate the law to a brutal extent, when in reality we know that Batman at the end of the day is going to drag the villain back to Arkham Asylum.
I'm willing to bet Jonah Hex has probably killed a bunch of people, but I like the way you think. I like the optimist in you. So all of this is a little weird because then we come back and Batman and Robin are listening to this perfectly timed story being told in the Batmobile as they're going to this old person's home.
It's perfect timing that the duration of this little cassette tape is, matches exactly the time it takes for them to travel.
Right.
To
from the
Ra's al
site
Ghul.
to this. Yeah, exactly. And Rage is there with this old man in a wheelchair that we now recognize as Arkady Duvall. Now, this is impossible. This man would be over 100 years old. So what's the explanation? Well, of course, it's Ra's al Ghul. You've got the Lazarus Pit.
Even its powers cannot restore him now. When his sentence was completed, Arkady simply wandered away. The privations he had suffered had left his mind shattered.
So, Dre, let's talk about, he was sentenced to 50 years hard labor, and no one expected him to survive, but he did, because he had been exposed to the Lazarus Pit early on in his life. But those 50 years were apparently torture for him because of these privations. So let's talk about these privations.
Well, certainly we don't know exactly what he had experienced, but the understanding is that he was isolated. He was, forced to undergo some kind of hard labor, and perhaps was exposed to, pretty serious conditions. Lack of water, lack of food, lack of social interaction, sleep deprivation. I'm actually making a lot of assumptions here, but the conclusion is that for someone to walk out shattered, with his mind shattered, to quote Raish, implies that the conditions were so harsh that there were long-term and maybe permanent mental health or psychological effects.
So I can't imagine that you've got any examples of real life people who have been in prison for 50 years.
Well, there are. I mean, it's interesting because when psychologists look to better understand the impacts of social isolation and lack of, just kind of the lack of social interaction, there are some interesting case examples that can help us out with just better. Just being better able to understand what the impacts are.
Do you have any examples of that?
Oh, I have one example.
Okay.
And you will immediately recognize this name, Bo Bergdahl.
Oh, all right.
So if anyone listening also listens to Serial.
We're capitalizing on the Serial podcast.
Right. Just press pause and go to Serial. No. If you're listening to Serial, this season is focusing on Bergdahl, but what his experiences were, I think are pretty amazing in terms of our ability to understand the impacts of being a prisoner, right? Being in isolation, being exposed to really harsh conditions. And we're still trying to understand his experience a little better. And of course, there are legal reasons why we don't have all the details and all the records around what his, what the consequences were for him.
But explain that. Like, in what way does Bergdahl help us understand what it means to be a prisoner?
So I believe he was a prisoner for 5 years. When he was released and brought back to the U.S., he basically went through the military's reintegration program. Mm-hmm. And that involved not just medical tests and debriefings, but also additional psychological meetings, sessions, time for him to process what happened to him. There are certain procedures that he needs to go through to ensure that he's safe to reintegrate back to what we would say like a civilian life. Mm-hmm. What that would look like.
Sure.
So his, and again, we do have examples. We do have prisoners of war. We also have examples from, unfortunately, from folks who have been detained, from, those hikers that were caught in Iraq and were detained for thousands of hours. One of them in particular, the female hiker reported being...
I'm sorry, you have to back up for a second.
Yeah.
There were hikers detained, like this is a story with which I'm not familiar.
Oh, okay.
So there were people who went hiking in Iraq, like, I guess Runyon Canyon is closed off for the weekend. We should go to Iraq and hike.
Yep, 3 hikers were hanging out in the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, and unfortunately were arrested by Iranian troops after straying onto the border with Iran. So they were kept in a prison, and the female hiker endured over 10,000 hours with very little human contact before she was freed. And the reason I bring up this example, not because of just the sheer ignorance maybe of hiking in this area, but the accounts that she shares with reporters and psychologists involve some interesting psychological impacts. She talks about seeing things, hearing things. She definitely can point to what we would say are hallucinations. So you have almost this break from reality, this lack of being able to perceive your environment the same way you normally would. And it's thought that extreme deprivation of sensory information in your environment actually can lead to the brain kind of trying to fill those gaps, and essentially what you have is the brain creating hallucinations. And it is a wild experience. And people who are in solitary confinement, people who have accounts from Pelican Bay prison up north, up in Northern California, folks who have been in isolation or solitary confinement for years will describe some of these more what we would call like bizarre types of effects. and even folks who force themselves to be in these scenarios, like folks who go through fasting or refuse to eat or drink water, after a few days will experience some of these really kind of delusional, bizarre, even psychotic types of symptoms because of the lack of physiological and neurobiological nourishment, the stuff that we need in order to kind of function well. So we have these accounts from prisoners, from detainees, from folks who get lost in the woods, folks who are excavators and are caving, or folks who are digging somewhere and get trapped, miners. I mean, we have these real accounts of people who get trapped or are, for one reason or another, deprived completely from social interaction and from our basic needs. So we know that at least in these scenarios where we're talking anywhere from, I don't know, several weeks to several years, that you have these immediate and some longer term effects psychologically. And interestingly, there are some studies that have deliberately put people in situations that I think now would probably be considered unethical, but back in what decade, Brian?
The 1950s?
Yeah, around that time.
Which I like to think of as the golden age of psychology, back when you could really perform cool experiments that really showed the test of the human brain.
Right. One of the most extensive and perhaps unethical by today's standards studies took place at McGill University Medical Center in Montreal by a psychologist, of course. And
wait, I'm sorry. Canadians did this?
Yes.
That was a different era.
Mainly college student participants were asked to spend several days up to weeks by themselves in what we would consider like cubicles, these little kind of soundproof boxes where they wouldn't have any human contact. And the psychologist was interested in what would happen to people when they had very minimal or reduced stimulation. And so what they did is they minimized the sensory input, right? So being able to feel, hear, see, and touch. And so they would put them in these gloves, and they would confine them in these areas and have them lie down. They would restrict noise. I mean, just kind of an interesting, very sensory deprived type of environment. And only after a few hours were there some notable differences and some notable signs and symptoms that were emerging. For instance, interesting singing, bizarre accounts of seeing and hearing things, high anxiety, strong emotional reactions, and very, very low cognitive functioning. So it's kind of the inability to really function at a level that most of us would normally. But they were, in the accounts of this study, they were saying that the hallucinations in particular were notable because of just how bizarre they were in terms of these participants reporting seeing certain lines and shapes and colors and animals flying across the room and, dogs and babies and all sorts of things, in addition to auditory hallucinations, which are hearing things that aren't really there. So
they were given schizophrenia?
Well, I mean, you bring up an interesting point that severe deprivation led to the mind. It's so interesting that Raish said that this person's mind shattered, because that's kind of what we see happening with just a few hours of deprivation. And so the psychologist who wrote about the trial, and by the way, of course, they cut it short.
Well, yeah.
Because it was too distressing.
They can never go the full however long.
No. And the psychologist said that it was very unsettling to find that in his own laboratory, merely taking away the usual sights, sounds, and bodily contacts from a healthy person for a few days can shake him right down to the base.
Yeah, but that's a college student. I mean, come on. You take the macaroni and cheese from them for a few days, and it's going to shake him to the base.
So we can imagine that this guy Duvall. Now he was, again, he was essentially imprisoned for 50 years. But you can imagine that he had an extreme version of this, right? And then it's possible, if we take the same framework, that, the deprivation leads to these bizarre kinds of symptoms, and the brain begins to kind of randomly fire and process things very differently, creating a different reality for him over time. That it's possible that he walked out of there a completely different person, if not a shell of a person.
That's actually really frightening. That really, it wouldn't even take 50 years of hard labor and privations to reach the level of sort of, I'll say it, crazy of Arkady Duvall that we see in the wheelchair. It really would just take a matter of hours or days or, maybe even weeks before you'd get to that point. And then maybe you're just messed up from then on out. But more to the point, we want to know why Ra's cares so much. And Batman wants to know the same thing.
You left Duvall to his fate a century ago. Why come back for him now?
Did you really think, Detective, that in my 600 years of life I would have sired only one offspring? Even before the Phoenix debacle, I had come to realize that Arkady was too unbalanced and cruel to wisely rule my empire.
But you couldn't forget about him.
What father can ever forget his son?
Aw.
I know.
And it's a weird image, too, because the son appears
to be
50
so
years
much
older than
yeah.
him, and is just...
That is true. I mean, but what I love about this particular episode is the level of detail. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be something that they thought about so much as it just plays perfectly with the fact that in continuity, if you go back to that episode, the Demon's Quest, Ra's al Ghul explains to Batman that he has no sons to take over as the new Ra's al Ghul. Like, that's why he's recruiting Batman to marry Talia to then become the new Ra's al Ghul. And in this episode, he admits that he completely lost track of Arkady until he ended up in that old person's home. So, like, he didn't even realize at that point that Arkady Duvall was an option.
No, or he had no sons that could take on the role.
Right.
Like, he doesn't consider him a son who could take on the role. Like, he's just too far gone. And as we talked about, doesn't meet the qualifications. Right? Doesn't have the honor, is too brutal, doesn't seem...
to have his faculties about him.
Well, prior to the hard labor and imprisonment.
I just thought that was a nice little moment where it's like, Batman, I'll take you over my kid, who I didn't even necessarily know was still alive until I found out that he was in an old person's home.
I have a kid in an old person's house. An old person's home.
I should probably... He's hanging out in an old person's house. I should probably go get him. Now, Drea, this leads us to the point that I think is the most controversial in this entire episode. And I need you to go with me here. Okay, so he then says, like, look, detective, you and I shall cross paths another day. Let me take my son. Now, let's keep in mind that Batman has caught Ra's al Ghul as a criminal for a number of different crimes. I mean, at this point, he's an international criminal. Batman just turns his back and lets him go. Like, he's like, yeah, you should probably take care of this. Like, I at what point does Batman have a responsibility to take Ra's al Ghul in?
I think he has to think about the motivation and potential at this point. Like, it's very clear that what Ra's al Ghul wants to do is to have these final moments with his son, right?
I'm pretty sure the kid is getting 3 squares a day at that old person's home.
At the house, the old person's
At
house.
the old person's house. Like, I'm pretty sure that guy's taken care of. You know, Ra's al Ghul is a criminal. Batman should have been like, you've broken like lots of laws. You've nearly killed people. I'm going to arrest you now. You just told me about an incident in the 1880s where you nearly killed people in a big flying ship. We've got that confession on tape. I'm going to arrest you now. But instead he just turns his back and lets...
But he doesn't, what I'm saying is that he doesn't turn his back on a crime. He turns his back on what is, I'm saying potentially this is Ra's al Ghul's moment or last moments to bond with his son.
I get that.
And there's something, remember Batman, you've got to remember that he lost his father.
No,
right?
See, this is where you become soft-hearted and the apologist. Batman, above all, needs to be the crime fighter, and you've got quite a bit on Ra's al Ghul, and you realize that he is quite superior to many other crime fighters or police or whatever. Like, this is your chance, man. You need to just take him, and you need to no, I've got you. Like, don't worry. We'll wheel in Arkady to say hi to you in between, meals while you're in an orange jumpsuit or something. Or if you're in Arkham Asylum, you'll probably be given your green cape and
the Lazarus
pit.
mini Lazarus pit.
You'll be given a Lazarus pit at Arkham Asylum. But,
I'm just saying that there's this element that in that moment, Batman reflects on the idea that this is about a father and son, and that if he had an opportunity to spend some last moments with his father, he would want that. So it's almost this offering. And Ra's al Ghul does say they're going to encounter each other in the near future. They know they are. Right,
but here's what I want to explain to you right here and now. In terms of this first 85 episodes of Batman the Animated Series and The Adventures of Batman and Robin, they never meet again. Like, Batman just let him go. It won't be until several years, a couple of years later when there's the new Batman Adventures.
Right.
When you might see him again. And in fact, he's not even seen again in the new Batman Adventures. So Batman doesn't encounter he just let Ra's al Ghul go forever.
Maybe there's this notion that Ra's al Ghul is reuniting with someone in his family, like reuniting and re-establishing this strong bond and potentially uncovering a new leaf. And so the reason they don't encounter each other again is because there isn't a crime committed on Ra's part.
Except that Ra's has committed many crimes up to this point. So it's not like those are forgiven. It's just like, I've now got you here. I could take you in. But I get what you're saying.
I think that this was ultimately about the father and son relationship. And what that means in this context is that there's this notion that the son should have followed in his father's footsteps, that the son should have had the same integrity, honor, and dignity. And although Ra's is a villain, there's this idea that there would be, this familial kind of connection and similarity. And I mean, it's really about a sense of handing down values and handing down this family's culture, even though it's messed up, right? I understand that it's totally messed up, but it doesn't work out. And so, I don't know, are there parallels with Batman's mission and what he's doing and whether he's living up to his father's values and his father's core principles and meaning, and that idea that, I don't know, maybe Batman or Bruce Wayne is falling short of that and is seen as a disappointment, is seen as someone who just needs to be put away.
Wow.
And just like Duvall.
Wow, I would have seen it as the opposite. I would have seen it as like, oh, that's the kid that was the disappointment, but I'm clearly the good son because I'm the one that was deemed worthy, except then I wasn't because I went against Pa.
If Batman were seen as being worthy of Raish's,
He's better than that.
Well, of course. Like,
Right.
he doesn't see
Okay.
himself as being someone who could be Raish's son. That's insulting to him. Brian?
Good call. Good call. What I appreciated about this episode is the cast list. This cast list for this episode was absolutely phenomenal. I don't know if you took notice, but as I was watching, I did notice a couple of voices that were familiar. As the credits rolled, there were a couple of really great names that popped up. For starters, we've got as the barmaid, the really nice lady who takes him
Yeah.
off to see the Lady Rocks, Elizabeth Montgomery, Bewitched.
Oh, yeah.
And unfortunately, because I watched this episode and I saw her name, I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like how old was she around this time? Like, this is around the time that she, passed away. And then I looked it up and it turns out that she passed away only about 4 months earlier than this episode actually aired. Like, this was like her last acting gig. But on top of that, as I mentioned, Malcolm McDowell, famous for many, many roles, A Clockwork Orange. He is notoriously famous for having killed Captain Kirk in Star Trek Generations. But the other person that I thought was of great interest, and Drea, you're going to love this, the governor that is driving the Golden Spike during the railroad celebration that Ra's al Ghul interrupts, is Senator Patrick Leahy. Now, this is a senator from Vermont who is a Democrat, huge Batman fan, and has in fact been in several Batman movies in like guest cameos, sort of appearances.
Wow.
Like a Democratic senator from Vermont is in Batman the Animated Series, and then in other movies like The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, and then of course he was in Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. We don't talk about those last two, but
Chill out.
we don't talk about those last
okay.
two. So that's awesome. I think this episode is awesome, if for no other reason than this cast list is absolutely amazing, and the fact that we actually get to hang out with Jonah Hex for a little while, and that's fantastic. Drea, I'm excited about next week. Until then, why don't you tell folks where they can find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc. My website is underthemaskonline.com. Of course, I co-run the community imzy.com/Arkham. Brian, where can folks find you?
You can find me. I am on Twitter. I am at bward028. We both run the at Arkham Sessions Twitter account. And you can email us both. We are arkhamsessions@gmail.com. I highly recommend that you follow our good friends over at Fanboy Comics. They are at Fanboy Comics on Twitter. Comics is spelled with an X. Or you could go to their website, fanboycomics.net, check out everything they've got to offer. It's all fantastic. And as Drea mentioned, come find us on imzy.com, imzy.com/Arkham. Get your invitation. It's going to be awesome. Until next week, I am Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And together we are
The Arkham Sessions.
We will cross swords another day.